the future interactions. So, we're almost at the point of no return. We are no longer willing to move this relationship forward. So we have the intentional decision to limit future interactions. Now, your post-interaction effects, meaning long after the relationship has been limited and we no longer interact, the famous line from the Eagles song, "You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave," Hotel California. We create a public statement about what was and what happened. So we have the post-interaction effects, even when we might have been separated, not like separated in a divorce term, but separated as in we have limited our future interactions for quite a long time. We will still have post-interaction effects, meaning there will still be instances where we are asked about it or it comes up in conversation and we have to have a public statement about what was, what existed, and then what happened. So you always have that long-term effect once a relationship has been dissolved, even if it's long after the relationship. So I want to talk about two theories briefly. We have a social exchange theory, where people seek the greatest amount of reward with the least amount of cost. And, we're kind of back to that self-serving mentality in relationships. And the social exchange theory is evaluated in terms of three basic components: immediate reward, forecasted reward, or cumulative rewards and or costs. So I think I'll address both, but you can understand that we can talk about immediate rewards, forecasted rewards, cumulative rewards, and then immediate cost, forecasted cost, cumulative cost. So people seek the greatest amount of reward with the least amount of cost. In other words, I want the biggest bang for my buck, right? So immediately I see that I have this reward in this relationship. Or, I'm forecasting out that if I have a relationship with this person, I'm going to get this reward out of it. Or over time, you notice, gosh, there's a lot of cumulative reward with this. The more I'm with this person, the more I have a relationship with this person, the more consistent benefits I get, and they accumulate, and I'm doing pretty well with this. On the flip side, you have the same process with your costs. So, I don't have very many immediate costs whatsoever to start this relationship, or I don't really foresee that I'm going to have costs in this relationship, or I don't think I'm going to continually have costs associated with this. So that social exchange theory, you want the greatest amount of reward with the least amount of cost. Dialectical theory is a theory that says opposing forces pull us toward intimacy or pull us toward independence. So the social exchange theory tends to be a little bit more interactional between individuals. In other words, there's more of a personal element there. So, let's look at what I have to offer you, what you have to offer me. Dialectical theory tends to be more removed from the personal element, where it says we either are drawn toward intimacy or we are pulled away from intimacy toward independence. And so almost like that dichotomy of magnetic forces, that you're going to be pulled in one direction or the other. That's what the dialectical theory is based on. So if we're thinking about skills for developing relationships, I don't want to tell you all of the negatives without giving you some skills and some helpful things too. So in the initiation stage for developing relationships, you want to be aware of approachability cues. So remember, we talked about your body posturing and how you can communicate whether or not you're approachable or available or interested by those nonverbal cues. So you want to have approachability cues. You don't want to seem standoffish. You don't want to seem disinterested. You don't want to seem indifferent. You want to have that aura about you that says, I'm approachable, I'm interested, I'm available. You want to identify and use conversation starters. So I asked you for what your favorite icebreaker was or what your favorite opening line of a conversation is. Identify and use them. That's a very easy way to develop a relationship in the initiation stage. Follow initiation rituals. So, I think you all at this point should know what those types of things are. Be aware of not going out on a limb and doing things that are not standard procedure in initial stages of relationships. Ask questions. That may become a conversation. Sometimes just merely asking a question will develop quite a significant conversation. It might not. Just watch for reactions, but that is also something you can do. And initially, don't expect too much. If you live in expectation, you will die in failure, as my mother tells me. So don't try to have too many expectations, at least initially. So now that's the initiation stage. When we're moving into the escalating relationship, so remember, elevators going up, many skills are the same as initiation, but this time you want to communicate attractiveness. So you're no longer necessarily communicating approachability, but you're now communicating attractiveness. Again, not necessarily sexual attractiveness, but things about you that make the other person interested. Be open and self-disclose appropriately. And remember, self-disclosure is based on level of intimacy, so that's why I say appropriately there. Gather information to reduce uncertainty, meaning the more you know, the less uncertain you will be. So that's helpful when the relationship is escalating. You don't want to feel confused or uncertain or kind of off in the relationship. So gather information. Monitor your perceptions. Take time to reflect on what you perceive and what you think, and are those accurate? And then listen actively and respond confirmingly. So, listen, remember, different from here, and respond. So you want to confirm. You're giving feedback at that point. You want to respond appropriately. Socially decenter and become other-oriented. And I know at this point that's ad nauseum. You've heard that so many times, but that's a really important element of the relationship escalating, because if it's all about you, it can't be about the relationship. So once you've escalated, you want to maintain the relationship. To do that, you express emotions. It's a form of self-disclosure. And I think often we think of self-disclosure in terms of verbally sharing, but expressing your emotions, which is often nonverbal, is also a form of self-disclosure, a very important form of self-disclosure. And timing is everything. So remember, when a child is drowning, it's not the time to teach them to swim. Same principle applies here. When you're going to express emotions, make sure that it's a good time to do so. Engage in relationship talk. In other words, spend some time discussing the relationship. A relationship is a third entity. So you have person one, person two, and the relationship. It's important. If you're going to talk about each other, you're going to talk about yourself, you're going to talk about the other person, it's also important to talk about the relationship, because that's its own individual component. Be tolerant and show restraint. What is gained by constantly pointing out flaws? And early on, I also asked you, do we have an obligation to be honest about everything when we're in a relationship? And most of you said no, because if you're constantly pointing out flaws, that is hurtful. Manage conflict cooperatively, and because of the very extensive lecture last week, you now know how to manage conflict cooperatively. So use those skills, and then seek compliance. You can use persuasive strategies to get what you want. In other words, when you are trying to get compliance, you're not trying to manipulate, you're trying to make sure that the other person is in agreement with what you want out of it. So compliance means, okay, yes, I agree with what you're saying, not I'm being forced into it. So now, what do you think about, some food for thought as always, how do you feel about meeting someone brand new? What do you think about if you think about meeting someone for the first time? How do you feel about that? Now, to further rack your brain, does gender have any effect on how you feel? So is it different if you're meeting someone of the same sex versus someone of the opposite sex? What factors make you more or less nervous? Second question, do you believe in love at first sight? Do you think there's a difference between love and lust? Third question, when you see someone you like, do you just go up to them and tell them? Why not? And again, we're not talking about opposite sex relationships necessarily. When you see someone that you like for whatever reason, do you go up and tell them? Why or why not? And as an aside, not to taint your response to that question, but I've really worked on that about myself, because I think I've shared with you, I tend to be very introverted and I tend to be perceived incorrectly sometimes based on my facial expressions, etc. So I've really worked on the looking glass self-concept and taking feedback from people and taking perceptions from people, etc., etc. And one of the things that I learned, or at least have developed as the time has gone on, is if I think something nice about somebody, I have really worked hard to tell them. In other words, if I say, gosh, that person has such a nice smile, if I think that in my head, then I feel that I should let them know that. So that's something that I've worked on. So in that specific instance, when you see someone that you like, do you go up and tell them? In that context, I say yes. I do that quite frequently. I will tell someone, if I think something nice about someone, I try to make it a point to tell them. If I think something not so nice about someone, I do not tell them. At least I try not to. So, I mean, in that specific instance, I think you can argue, yes, you do go up and tell them if you see someone you like. But I'm sure there are other instances where you would argue no, so please feel free to share. How would you respond to someone doing that to you? To kind of play the opposite side of the coin there. And then finally, fourth question, what is pre-interaction awareness to you? What do you look for in signs that someone is interested or not interested? So now that you see those four questions, I would like you to choose one of those four to answer in your reflection post. So either, how do you feel about meeting someone brand new with those two qualifiers? Do you believe in love at first sight with that qualifier? When you see someone you like, do you just go up to them and tell them? Why or why not? And how would you respond to that? Or what is pre-interaction awareness? What do you look for in signs that someone is interested or not interested? So please choose whichever one of those you feel most compelled about and put that in your reflection post. Okay, so now we're talking about characteristics of relationships that ended well or that ended badly. So just briefly, what's the first thing that pops into your head if I say, what's a characteristic of a relationship that ends well? Whatever that is. What is a characteristic of a relationship that ends poorly? What is that? What post-interaction effects can you identify? And remember, post-interaction effects is the message that you craft to talk about what was and what happened. So what post-interaction effects can you identify based on whether the relationship ended well or whether the relationship ended badly? So think about your current relationships, even if they're varied in level of intimacy. So at any given time, we have thousands of relationships. So what level of intimacy, wow, that was not coming out well. What level of intimacy we have with one individual is not necessarily the same for someone else. So you can have varied levels of intimacy in the relationships that you're thinking about. What behaviors do you use to keep that level of intimacy stable? So remember, we've talked about how we escalate the relationship and then we either maintain it or we escalate it further. So whatever relationship level you're in, what behaviors do you use to keep those levels stable? And these are more food for thoughts. I'm not asking you to reflect about these in the posts, but just think through that, because I think that will help you recognize what is going into those different relationships. Have you or the other person tried to increase or decrease the level of intimacy? How? And or how did you or they respond? Okay, so managing, those are all food for thought questions.